Okay, so why is Bitcoin better at violence resistance by an order of magnitude versus something like gold? And why is that important? In short, what problem does Bitcoin solve? And we talked before about monetary policy and soundness and how the financial system is starting to look a little bit fishy. But to really boil it down, the problem that Bitcoin solves is the political determination of wealth. So, money overall is an answer to the question of who gets what and why. And you can look at politics too as answering the same question, who gets what and why. And it would be nice if the answer to that question would be those who deserve it. Now, of course, that's such a loaded question in so many ways, and that's why politics is such a minefield, and why money can be such a minefield. But it should be an idea that you're familiar with and that you think about. Unfortunately, a big part of politics is answering the who gets what and why question as me, because I want it. And then you have this whole problem of having to deceive entire populations into thinking that it's actually some sort of disinterested system that doesn't necessarily play political favorites. So, yes, Bitcoin solves some problems with monetary policy and sound money and all of that. But I think fundamentally the problem it's solving is the political determination of wealth. That is, it should be possible to be wealthy regardless of your current political favor. Now, how does it do that? What's the problem it's solving? Well, let's look at how payments happen today in an increasingly popular way of payment, credit cards. So credit cards, much like 0% interest rates and much like money that's not backed by gold at all, are actually relatively new. Sure, they've been around for a while in the 20th century, but the actual depth of penetration that we see with credit cards today is quite new. The point now, I usually pay for things with cash, and almost every single time they have to be like, "Oh, yep, sorry," and put the machine away. People will be surprised if you're not paying with a credit card. Of course, the way that credit cards work is, you're swiping your Visa or whatever in the machine, and that's sending some data. It's saying, "Hey, this Visa card belongs to this person." This is Joey's Visa, and he's paying $10 for this burrito at Taco Bell. And it's sending that information to a computer. Now, what computer is it sending it to? It's sending it to a computer owned by Visa, where Visa can process those transactions. And Visa just has a record somewhere that says, yes, this is Joey's card. Joey has this much credit and this much money, so he does have $10. We'll check it against our record, and we can process that payment, and then it goes back to the merchant. Now, there's all sorts of other terrible things going on behind the scenes. The merchant's not going to get that $10 immediately. That payment's going to get batched usually much later. And then if I'm not paying my bills on time, there's all these interest rates and other things that pile up. But crucially, it's centralized in that there's this one company who's processing the payment. And they're doing that for a fee. And it's also associated with one's identity. And that's where that political determination gets in, right? So they have to know who I am, where I live, there's a billing address, all of these things, and what I'm buying to process this payment. And on top of that, they're charging a fee for that. Now, most people don't know or don't think about a lot of those factors, and maybe in some contexts it's not that important. The way Bitcoin solves this is by removing that identity portion of it, and by removing the central point of failure portion of it. So it works in a similar way, and that when you send a Bitcoin transaction, you are broadcasting a transaction, and that transaction includes similar information as the Visa one we were talking about. But instead of being tied to an identity, it's tied to something called a Bitcoin address, which we'll talk about later. And it's saying, hey, this Bitcoin address sends this amount of Bitcoin to this other Bitcoin address. Now, that needs to be verified. You need to know that one Bitcoin address has enough money to send it to another Bitcoin address. And to do that, one way you could do it is you could have some company that's processing all these transactions the way Visa does, and the way that humans have usually done it. The problem with that, of course, is you're now subject to political influence. So instead, you broadcast that transaction out on the internet, and you have anybody who's listening for these transactions able to process them. And this is what mining is. Now, mining has to be incentivized in various ways. It's incentivized by transaction fees, which is the same way that Visa is incentivized to process payments. That's their business model. And it's also incentivized right now by continued creation of the money supply in Bitcoin. So that's why you wouldn't just have one person out there saying, "Oh, great, I'm going to process all of these transactions." It actually becomes competitive because it's potentially profitable. It's separate from your identity, and there are multiple parties doing it. So that's what offers that layer of political resistance. And you can see, hints of political issues coming with payment processors now. Credit cards have backed off some politically sensitive companies to back. A few years ago, a company called Backpage dropped their MasterCard and Visa dropped their support for processing their payments, and there wasn't a trial, there wasn't a court case, there wasn't any due process. It was, I believe, a letter from a sheriff in one county in the state of Illinois to the company, and in fairness, from Visa and MasterCard's perspective, they're like, well, it's just not worth our business time here. It's not worth it for us. We're not political crusaders. We're not here to uphold any deterministic rights, right? They're looking out for their own interests. So they're always going to be subject to political pressure. Whereas with Bitcoin, if these transactions are just always out on the internet, they're not necessarily tied to anybody's identity, and people are competing to process them because it's profitable, you can solve that problem. You can solve that problem of wealth and payments being politically determined. Now, that's just an early introduction. We're looking at, what happens when you swipe a credit card? Well, what happens when you send a Bitcoin transaction? Main difference, you swipe a credit card, you're sending some information. It's your identity, it's how much money you're trying to spend, and then you're sending it to one company, and they say, oh yeah, Joey, we know Joey. Joey's got this much money to spend, so he can spend that much money, or he can't spend that much money. And that gets processed, and they charge a fee. Now compare that to cryptocurrency, where you send a Bitcoin transaction, you're just broadcasting that transaction on a network. Anybody in the world is free to try to process that transaction, and there's an incentive to process that transaction, but it's not tied to your identity, and it's competitive. Now, we'll get into more about how this competition works and how all of these incentives are interdependent and how it can successfully build up the system that we've talked about earlier. But that's the key. What problem is Bitcoin solving? It's removing the political determination of wealth. Money is about who gets what and why. If you think about money right now, people who are rich, that's just saying, hey, this person deserves this much goods and services because they've earned this much goods and services. Who gets what and why? Which, of course, is a political question. And today, more than in the recent past, that's becoming politically deterministic. And Bitcoin can potentially remove that political determinism.